Anyhow, my reflection today is a critique of some popular ways of defining a serious problem in our country. And therefore, I feel it more necessary to begin my reflection today with a caveat. And it's a caveat I could just as easily use to begin every reflection I do. And that is, I do not consider myself an expert, nor the last word on any of the topics I reflect on. No one who listens to me ought accept what I say without question. The minister of this congregation, Reverend Ron Ferris, does not agree with me on this topic. Nevertheless, I chose the topic, and I choose all my topics because I believe they're ones that we should consider and ones we should question and discuss. Now, in spite of my disagreement with the way many liberals in the UUA use the terms white privilege and white supremacy, I do still believe that it's critical that all of us Americans address racial injustice. Racial injustice has been a problem as long as our country has existed. Until it is fully addressed and dealt with, it will drag our country down economically, socially, and culturally. Waiting until all the old bigots die is not a viable strategy. In order to explain my criticism, I need to roam a bit. First of all, I will talk about my own experience with the struggle for racial justice in this country. I'll also critique the popular use of those terms that I stated before, which are the terms white supremacy and white privilege, including the use of the terms in the book, White Fragility. And finally, I will talk about my idea of how we need to approach racial justice and what I think are the barriers to addressing it. I am not unfamiliar with the struggles to eradicate racial injustice. Here are some of my experiences. As a high school student, I was active in LRY, the Unitarian Youth Group. I was the vice president of our chapter, and as vice president, I was responsible for the programs. So I invited a speaker from CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, to address us. One part of his talk I will never forget was about the training that they had to have for nonviolent demonstration. When the police would show up, demonstrators were taught to fall on top of someone else to protect the other from the police billy clubs. After taking all the beating one could stand, it was okay to roll over and let the other person roll on top and take a beating for a while. One did that until the police wore out. The minister of my Unitarian church in Sacramento heeded the call from Martin Luther King Jr. to travel to Selma to witness and demonstrate against the way demonstrators were being treated by the police in Selma. Our minister was injured there, but thankfully not seriously. However, another Unitarian minister, the Reverend James Reeb, was beaten to death by white Southerners the same night our minister was hurt. White supremacists attacked them to protect segregation as a way of life. I was still in high school, and another member of the LRY, my Unitarian youth group, approached me. She had heard that a Mr. White was coming from Mississippi to Sacramento with the intention of starting a chapter of the Citizens Council in Sacramento. Sacramento is where I lived. For those of you who are not around or do not recall, the Citizens Councils were popularly known as the White Citizens Councils. The White Citizens Councils were the overt political arm of the Ku Klux Klan. We decided that we would infiltrate the organizing meeting and disrupt it. I was about 16. As usual, we had no idea how we were going to do it. As it turned out, we were barred from entering the meeting. As soon as we were denied, I pulled my SNCC pin out of my pocket, put it on my shirt, and we went out to join the people demonstrating against the Citizens Council. SNCC, by the way, is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who were really important in registering black people in the South to vote. We had demonstrated for less than an hour when someone came out of the meeting and announced that the meeting had voted in a platform of civil rights and sent Mr. White off packing back to Mississippi. We were invited inside to help celebrate the victory. When I entered the hall, it was like a party, with everyone cheering. And what I remember most vividly was Merritt Winans, a leader in my Unitarian congregation, standing in front of the meeting with a gavel, and he was leading both the meeting and the cheering. In 1967, I had the good fortune to hear Ralph Ellison talk about his novel, The Invisible Man. I later read the novel in the context of a class I took in the Black Studies program. The book described what it was like to live as a black man in America. Its premise was that being black is like being socially invisible. Later, as I worked and socialized more with people of color, I saw what Ellison meant. Although black people were present, it was as though their individuality was not seen. Black people were masked by the way people of color were seen in our society. So why is the invisible man relevant here? Because when the recent Black Lives Matter movement began, I applauded the fact that it focused on people whose lives needed to be focused on. To me, it meant that perhaps they would no longer be invisible. Their names were spoken. When the movement seemed to change to one that focused on white privilege and later white supremacy, my gut told me that once again, white people were taking the problem and making it about them. Who is the focus of white privilege and white supremacy? Once again, it's white people. It's as if white people instinctively reacted that Black Lives Matter made black people the focus. Now is a good time to transition to what I think about the use of the terms white privilege and white supremacy. The words we use matter. The UUA and many liberals are using the terms white privilege and white supremacy in ways that hurt our ability to fight racial injustice. There are three specific errors in using the terms white supremacy and white privilege. First of all, the analysis using white supremacy feels like a force fit. All of our lives, white supremacy meant one thing, and now we're asked to accept a definition that is dubious and distracting. Secondly, the term white privilege is used indiscriminately. Instead of pointing to the problem, it points to the people who are not experiencing the problem and says that somehow that is the problem. Thirdly, and what I find most disturbing, the language of white privilege and white supremacy directs focus away from the people who are being treated unfairly and, as is usually the case, makes white people's feelings the central concern. So let's talk about white supremacy. As I stated earlier, I applaud our support of Black Lives Matter. To me, it is clear and directed towards a serious problem and the people who directly experience the problem. On the other hand, both the UUA and many liberals have taken to using the terms white privilege and white supremacy. While these are different terms, they are often used together and by the same people. What the two terms also have in common is that they're often used incorrectly. For example, Susan Frederick Gray asked us to read the book White Fragility to understand white supremacy in our society, in our association, and in our congregation. The book argues by use of examples. However, if one does not begin with the assumption that the examples used represent white supremacy, the book does not work. In other words, you have to assume that it is what they say it is in order to believe that their examples are worth anything. For example, in the book, the author cites a mother in a crowd whose child suddenly blurts out something like, "Look, Mom, he's black." The mother is embarrassed and tells the child to be quiet. She does other things that you would expect a mother to do in that situation. She acts in a way that reflects her discomfort. The author uses that scenario to point out how we are uncomfortable dealing with race and the child is being taught that it is impolite to talk about race. The author then goes on to claim that this scenario is an example that we're living in a culture of white supremacy because we're afraid to confront how we think of others as having a race. I could not help shaking my head when I read the passage. The mother's action displayed surprise, fear of putting a stranger on the spot, and maybe a bit of fear of having her parenting skills judged. It was a stretch to call this an example of white supremacy. Excuse me. The concept of white supremacy was force-fit to make the author's point. Time after time, I felt the same as other scenarios were used to make the author's point. The author's thesis is that white supremacy is no longer an ideology that white people are superior to other races. Rather, the author states, it is a culture that is crafted with the intention of keeping white people in charge. Unfortunately, this book, White Fragility, is typical of the kinds of arguments I've seen supporting the theory that racial injustice is tied to a culture of white supremacy. When examined, it just doesn't hold together. So what about the other term, white privilege? I was confused when a couple of years ago I first read white privilege used in social media as a label for various instances of racial injustice. So I asked the people who are using those terms what they meant by them. Without exception, they all gave me examples of racial injustice targeting people of color, contrasted with the reality that white people generally do not experience the same injustice. I agree. That happens. People of color, particularly black people, are often denied rights that are guaranteed by the Constitution. The fact that it happens at all is unconscionable, and the fact that it happens with frequency is tragic. But to me, that definition of white privilege means that white people enjoying their rights guaranteed by the Constitution is a problem. If it came to be that white people were suddenly stopped for driving in their own neighborhoods, if it came to be that white people were more likely to be shot by police for no reason, it would not directly improve life for people of color. I defy anyone to explain how it would. Denying white people their rights because black people are denied them does not increase a black person's ability to get promoted or win public office. It does not ease a Latino child's access to education or health care. It does not protect the legal status of same-sex couples who want to order a cake, nor does it protect a woman's right to choose. In fact, it would do nothing to improve racial justice, nor make it any clearer what needs to be done to prevent it. Think about it. On the one hand, you have a group of people who are enjoying a right that's guaranteed by the Constitution, and on the other hand, you have people who are being denied rights that should be guaranteed by the Constitution. And using the term white privilege means we should be focusing on the people who are getting their rights, not on the people who are not getting their rights. To me, that's backwards. Focusing on white privilege as a solution only serves to promote guilt, and the value of making people feel guilty is dubious. In order to better explain what I think the result is of focusing on white privilege and white supremacy, I'll use an analogy. Imagine that you're a firefighter. You're in a station, asleep for the night, but totally ready to spring into action. The alarm is sounded. Your actions reflect how well you've been trained to act. Soon you are fully equipped. You realize that seconds are precious when addressing an emergency. Before you know it, you are on a fire engine speeding to the site of a fire. You see the smoke before you see the burning house. When you're close, you see flames coming from the first floor windows. Before the engine even stops, you see people looking out the windows of the second story. Their faces are full of hope and fear. You jump off the engine, you're waiting instructions as to how to save the people trapped by the fire. As you have been trained, you focus on the chief for instructions. He steps from his vehicle and turns to address you and the other firefighters. And he begins. As you all know, we have an unhealthy relationship with fire. We cannot expect to make any progress with this problem until we admit this unhealthy relationship and understand how we have benefited from the misuse of fire. You're confused. Why is he wasting precious seconds? How is he helping? Your confusion turns to anger. You watch the face of the people on the second floor lose hope. Now they show only fear. They realize that you're not there to save them, but only to focus on your own issues. It will soon be too late. You can still hear your chief talking, but you have stopped listening. Your focus is on the hopeless faces in the windows, and you feel that they and you have been let down by your leadership. I have many more experiences I could share with you. For example, the extra steps that people of color, gay people, or women go through in order to make sure they are safe, that straight white men generally don't need to do. Unfortunately, I do not have time to describe all those ordeals this morning. But what would I do to improve the situation? Our society is ideally set up for an even playing field. The laws and the Constitution assume an even playing field. However, the playing field is not even. I believe we need to take affirmative steps, cautious steps, to make the playing field more even. For example, many of the programs introduced in Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty actually worked. They were not politically popular, and reactive politics wanted lower taxes instead, but the poverty rate actually fell for the first time during his administration. Reprising and modernizing the programs of the War on Poverty would not only help black people, but many other poor people, such as poor white people and Native Americans. Medicare for everyone, early childhood education, free child care for working mothers, expanded Head Start could also help level the playing field. If those people are waiting for a fair opportunity, it will not come fast enough, but we have to try. We also have to deal compassionately with those who fear that change is coming too fast. Change is always controversial, and change is always difficult. Just look at the decision we made to leave our previous church home. Or I'm wearing a pin, UU pin, that has the old design on it instead of the new design. And I'm sure there are some people who objected to the change of the design. In the midst of all the controversy and difficulty, we have to celebrate diversity and difference without creating division and schisms. A wise rabbi stated centuries ago, I cut something out, sorry about that. As Lisa McDaniel Hutchings stated in a sermon delivered to this congregation well over a year ago, we really only need one commandment, not 10. That commandment is, thou shalt not other. We, as Unitarian Universalists, were othered when an armed man walked into the service at the Tennessee Valley Unitarian Universalist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee, opened fire, killing several people in attendance and traumatizing the entire congregation. The Tree of Life Synagogue was attacked because the Jewish people of that congregation were othered. In 2015, a white supremacist entered the Brother Emmanuel House of Worship in Charleston, South Carolina, a church used primarily by black worshipers, and gunned down several members there because he othered them. In my opinion, using the words white privilege and white supremacy inappropriately creates unnecessary division and schism and othering. Diversity brings in many ideas, talents, and capabilities. Diversity enhances communications between differing cultures, and experiences. Diversity creates a stronger, more resilient society increases the resources we can draw on and creates a happier culture. Division and schism cuts off communication, cooperation, and progress. Racial justice helps everyone. The actions that help improve diversity and cooperation help us all. We all benefit from a more even playing field and the ability to bring diverse and differing ideas and talents to bear on our future challenges. May we all work together to create a more even playing field and a more just world where we do not just tolerate difference, but embrace diversity. Blessed be. So please join in singing hymn number 118, This Little Light of Mine.